The morning mist clung to the Heights of Abraham like a shroud, as Major General James Wolfe stared across the plains toward the walls of Quebec. It was the 13th of September, 1759, and the fate of two empires would be decided. Before the sun reached its zenith, the British general's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the fever that had racked his body for weeks. Behind him, 4,800 red-coated soldiers stood in perfect formation, their bayonets catching the first rays of dawn. Across the battlefield, Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, Marquis de Saint-Fran, hurriedly assembled his forces. The French commander had been caught completely off guard by Wolfe's audacious night assault up the seemingly impossible cliffs. His scouts had reported the impossible, British soldiers scaling the treacherous path in darkness, hauling cannon and supplies with them. Now, as church bells rang across Quebec City in alarm, Montcalm faced a terrible choice: retreat behind the city's walls, or meet the British in open battle. "Gentlemen," Wolfe addressed his officers, his voice carrying despite its weakness, "we have but one chance to strike at the heart of New France. Today, we write the first chapter of what will become the greatest treaty in British history." His words proved prophetic, though he would not live to see the Treaty of Paris signed for years hence. The 7 Years' War had raged across continents. From the forests of Pennsylvania to the plains of Germany, from the coasts of India to the sugar islands of the Caribbean. But here, on this September morning, the future of North America hung in the balance. Montcalm, veteran of European campaigns, knew that defeat here would mean the collapse of French power in the New World. As the French columns advanced across the plain, their white uniforms bright against the autumn grass, Wolfe ordered his men to hold their fire. The British line, thin as paper but disciplined as steel, waited with muskets primed. At 60 yards, the command rang out, "Fire!" The thunderous volley shattered the morning air, and when the smoke cleared, the French advance had crumbled. Both Wolfe and Montcalm lay mortally wounded, but the battle was won. Quebec would fall, and with it, the dream of a French empire in America. The victory at the Plains of Abraham would prove to be the decisive moment that made the Treaty of Paris inevitable. As Wolfe died in the arms of his officers, reportedly, uttering, "Now God be praised, I will die in peace," he could not have known that his sacrifice would lead to Britain gaining control of all French territories east of the Mississippi River, fundamentally redrawing the map of North America. While smoke still rose from the battlefield at Quebec, 3,000 miles away in the courts and chancelleries of Europe, diplomats were already calculating the price of victory and defeat. King Frederick II of Prussia, the warrior philosopher known as Frederick the Great, paced the gardens of Sanssouci Palace, contemplating how the fall of Quebec would affect his own desperate struggle against Austria, Russia, and France. 7 Years' War was never merely about colonial conquest. It was a global conflict that pitted the great powers against each other in an intricate dance of alliance and betrayal. In Europe, Frederick fought for survival against overwhelming odds, while in India, Robert Clive's victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757 had already begun dismantling French influence in the subcontinent. Each victory and defeat in these distant theaters would ultimately influence the negotiations that would produce the Treaty of Paris. Maria Theresa, Empress of Austria, sat in her palace in Vienna, studying dispatches from her generals. Of Quebec concerned her less than Frederick's continued resistance. But she understood that France's colonial defeats were bleeding her ally dry. Every ship that King Louis XV sent to defend Canada or India was one less vessel available to supply French armies in Germany. The global nature of the conflict meant that victories in one theater directly impacted campaigns in another. In London, Prime Minister William Pitt, the Elder, known as the Great Commoner, orchestrated Britain's war effort with unprecedented vigor. His strategy was simple, yet revolutionary: use Britain's naval supremacy to attack French colonies worldwide while subsidizing allies on the European continent to keep French armies occupied. This two-pronged approach would prove devastatingly effective and would give Britain enormous leverage when peace negotiations began, according to historical documentation from the Oxford Handbook of the 7 Years' War. The interconnected nature of the conflict meant that any eventual peace treaty would need to address not just territorial adjustments in North America, but also the balance of power in Europe, the Caribbean, and India. The complexity of these negotiations would require diplomatic skills of the highest order. The death of Empress Elizabeth of Russia in January 1762 changed everything. Her nephew Peter III was a fervent admirer of Frederick the Great and immediately withdrew Russia from the war. This miracle of the House of Brandenburg allowed Frederick to concentrate his forces against Austria and France, fundamentally altering the strategic balance. Meanwhile, Spain's entry into the war in 1762 on France's side came too late to change the outcome, but would significantly complicate the eventual peace. Negotiations. The tropical heat of Havana shimmered off the cobblestones as British forces under the Earl of Albemarle laid siege to Spain's most prized Caribbean fortress in the summer of 1762. The capture of Havana, along with its vast treasure fleet, represented the culmination of Britain's global strategy. However, the victory came at a terrible cost. Yellow fever killed more British soldiers than Spanish bullets ever did. Admiral Sir George Pocock's fleet had arrived in Cuban waters in June, carrying 14,000 troops and marines. The siege that followed would become one of the most expensive victories in British military history. For every Spanish defender killed, disease claimed 3 British attackers. Yet the strategic importance of Havana made the sacrifice worthwhile, as it gave Britain control of the Caribbean's most important port. Simultaneously, British forces captured Manila in the Philippines, dealing another devastating blow to Spanish prestige. These victories in the final phase of the war would prove crucial in the peace negotiations, giving Britain bargaining chips to trade for more valuable concessions. The Earl of Bute, who had replaced Pitt as Prime Minister, understood that Britain's position, while militarily dominant, was financially precarious. The war had cost Britain over £80 million, staggering sum that threatened to bankrupt the nation. Despite its victories, public debt had doubled, and the prospect of continued fighting against both France and Spain seemed ruinous. In Paris, the situation was even worse. Louis XV's treasury was virtually empty, and French forces had suffered defeat after defeat across the globe. The sugar islands of the Caribbean had become as important as the forests of Canada in determining the war's outcome. Guadeloupe, captured by the British in 1759, produced more revenue in a single year than all of Canada's fur trade. This economic reality would heavily influence the peace negotiations, with some British politicians arguing that keeping sugar islands was more valuable than vast but sparsely populated Canadian territories. The capture of Havana also demonstrated Britain's complete naval supremacy. Spanish treasure fleets, the lifeblood of the Spanish Empire, could no longer safely traverse the Atlantic. French convoys attempting to resupply their remaining colonies faced almost certain interception. This maritime dominance meant that even if fighting continued, France and Spain had no realistic hope of reversing their colonial losses. As 1762 drew to a close, all parties began to recognize that continued warfare would only deepen their mutual exhaustion without significantly altering the strategic situation. The time for diplomacy had arrived, and the stage was set for the most important peace conference of the 18th century in the elegant salons of Versailles. The Duc de Choiseul paced before a map of the world that showed French territorial losses in red ink. As Louis XV's foreign minister, Choiseul faced an impossible task: negotiating a peace that would save French honor while acknowledging the reality of comprehensive defeat. The winter of 1762 brought unofficial contacts between French and British representatives, leading to secret negotiations that would reshape the global balance of power. The British position seemed unassailable. They controlled Canada, most of the Caribbean, key positions in India, and had even captured Havana and Manila. However, the Earl of Bute faced domestic political pressures that complicated his negotiating position. Parliament was growing restless about the war's enormous cost, while merchant interests in London demanded certainty about trade routes and colonial boundaries. The first secret meetings took place in a modest house on the Rue Saint-Antoine. In Paris, Choiseul's representative, the Duke of Bedford, met with British negotiator Lord Hertford in sessions that would determine the fate of millions. The French position was desperate, but not entirely without leverage. They still held Minorca and the Mediterranean and could threaten British interests in India if the war continued. King Louis XV himself took an active role in the negotiations. Recognizing that this treaty would define his reign's legacy, the Sun King's great-great-grandson faced the humiliating prospect of surrendering
the North American Empire
that his ancestors had built. Pragmatism demanded accepting reality. France simply could not continue fighting a war it had already lost. The negotiations were further complicated by Spain's late entry into the conflict. King Charles III of Spain had hoped to reverse Britain's gains, but the loss of Havana had shattered Spanish morale. The capture of their premier Caribbean fortress demonstrated that even Spain's strongest positions were vulnerable to British naval power. Spanish negotiators found themselves in the awkward position of trying to recover territories they had lost in a war they had joined only months before. Frederick the Great of Prussia, meanwhile, negotiated separately at Huberdosberg Castle, dealing primarily with Austria and Russia. However, the Prussian king's survival and the preservation of Silesia would indirectly affect the global settlement. France's inability to achieve meaningful victories in Germany weakened their position in colonial negotiations. According to research from the American Battlefield Trust, the complexity of the negotiations reflected the war's global scope. Every territorial concession in one theater had to be balanced against gains or losses elsewhere. British negotiators had to decide whether keeping Canada was worth returning Havana to Spain, whether holding Guadeloupe justified giving up territorial claims in India. The winter of 1762 stretched into spring 1763. As negotiators worked through hundreds of details, boundary lines in North America had to be precisely defined. Fishing rights in the North Atlantic required careful delineation, and trading privileges in various ports needed explicit protection. Each clause of the eventual treaty represented hours of debate and compromise. As spring arrived in 1763, the negotiating teams gathered at the Hôtel de Soubise in Paris faced their most challenging decisions. The preliminary articles had been agreed upon, but the devil lay in the details. Every island in the Caribbean, every trading post in India, every mile of frontier in North America had to be precisely allocated. The future of millions of people hung in the balance as diplomats argued over maps and treaty language. Lord Bedford, representing British interests, found himself in the remarkable position of choosing between various conquered territories. Britain could not keep everything they had captured without provoking immediate renewal of the war. The question became, which conquests were most valuable to British interests? The sugar islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe generated immediate wealth, but the vast territories of Canada offered long-term strategic value. The French negotiating team, led by Choiseul, fought desperately to preserve some vestige of their American empire. They proposed keeping Louisiana west of the Mississippi while ceding everything to the east. They argued for retaining fishing rights off Newfoundland, vital to France's maritime economy. Most importantly, they sought to keep the valuable sugar islands that were the jewels of their Caribbean empire. Spanish representatives, still smarting from the loss of Havana and Manila, found themselves in an increasingly difficult position. King Charles III had entered the war hoping to check British expansion, but instead had only multiplied Spanish losses. The Spanish negotiators were forced to contemplate significant territorial concessions in Florida to recover their Caribbean and Pacific territories. The economic implications of every decision were staggering. British merchants in London calculated that control of the Great Lakes fur trade could be worth hundreds of thousands of pounds annually. The sugar production of a single Caribbean island might exceed the value of an entire North American colony. These commercial considerations often outweighed purely strategic concerns in the negotiations. Meanwhile, the human cost of these territorial transfers was becoming apparent. Thousands of French settlers in Canada would find themselves subjects of the British Crown. Spanish colonists in Florida faced similar displacement. Native American tribes who had fought on various sides throughout the conflict discovered that their homelands were being traded like commodities without any consideration of their wishes or rights. The negotiations also had to address the complex question of Catholic rights in formerly French territories. British law prohibited Catholic worship in many contexts, but the French population of Canada was overwhelmingly Catholic. Special provisions would be needed to prevent religious persecution and potential rebellion in newly acquired territories. French foreign policy would soon focus on finding ways to challenge British dominance through support for Britain's enemies. Spain's experience with the treaty was more complex. While the loss of Florida was significant, the recovery of Havana and Manila was essential to maintaining Spanish prestige. King Charles III's ministers began planning reforms to strengthen Spanish colonial administration and military capabilities. The treaty's provisions regarding Spanish colonial trade created new opportunities for economic development, even as territorial losses demonstrated Spanish vulnerability. The Treaty of Paris established legal and diplomatic precedents that would influence international relations for generations. The principle that colonial territories could be transferred between European powers without consulting their inhabitants became firmly established in international law. The treaty's detailed provisions regarding trade rights, navigation privileges, and territorial boundaries created templates for future diplomatic agreements. Perhaps most significantly, the treaty's success in ending such a widespread conflict demonstrated that even global wars could be resolved through negotiation rather than mutual exhaustion. The diplomatic techniques developed during the Paris negotiations, secret preliminary discussions, careful balancing of interests, detailed provisions for implementation became standard practices in international diplomacy, yet the peace proved fragile in ways its architects could not anticipate. Britain's overwhelming victory created resentment in France and Spain that would fuel their support for American independence just 13 years later. The enormous costs of victory forced British taxation policies that would spark rebellion in the very colonies the war had been fought to protect. The treaty that seemed to establish permanent British dominance instead created conditions for its eventual limitation, proving that in international relations, every victory contains the seeds of future conflict.